I am a ranking specialist because I was in charge of the FT rankings for 6 years. So during this year, so I was in charge of the data collection for the FT through the data cleaning and the production calculation through the publication and analysis. So I've got lots of experience working with business school in terms of post-data collection, quality assurance, and understanding the school needs. A big part of the job was being representative, ambassadorship for the FT. So a lot of the job is explaining the methodology, the question, and making sure that people answer the question the way they're meant to be. We have to split between university rankings and business school rankings, so they're very different. On the university side, there are mostly three of them. There's a Shanghai ranking, there is the Times Higher Education ranking, and then there's QS. And on the business school side, there are many rankings done by many different organizations, but the most serious one, I would say, are the Financial Times, The Economist, Bloomberg Business Week, and QS. That's a very interesting question. If you look at an MBA, for example, you can have very different MBA, with 800 students or 40 students. It can be 2 years or 1 year, but at the end, it's still an MBA. The students get more or less the same degree. Comparing universities is a lot more tricky. If in Europe, you go from selection at entry to selection via grades. So you got very small cohorts or very large cohorts. You got very high pass rates or very low pass rate if the selection is done through grades. So universities are very different. They tend to be very large. There's a lot of orbiting units around them. And it's very hard to measure something which does apply to all across. So that's why the university ranking tend to focus a lot on research and reputation, because this is a kind of broad measure you can compare for all of them. Business school ranking, on the end, tend to be a lot more narrow and focused. They tend to have more criteria. The FT typically focus on career progression, diversity during the program, and research. The Economist, they look a lot at diversity and student satisfaction. So all these rankings have their different methodology. They're all a little bit similar in a way. I think university ranking I think they really struggle to find some hardcore measure that as your students would be interested in. For example, it's interesting, before doing this interview, I had a look at the latest methodology. None of them calculate fee in their methodology. So, for me as a student, cost of living a fee, that would be one of the high factors I would consider. None of them do link with industry or whether the program includes an internship. They don't do employment rates. And that, again, it's because university programs are very different. Typically in France, if you do an undergraduate, you tend to do a postgraduate straight away. Well, for example, in the UK, you do the undergraduate, then you start looking for a job. So, you couldn't compare employment rate there. So, in business school, the business school ranking, it's a bit easier because typically they all include employment rates, which is the employment three months after graduation. So this is kind of a hard measure. There is fairly good standards to measure this data. So it gives you a very good idea of what you can expect. The program length is very well established. You know the number of participants. All rankings tend to include some salary measures. So you get an idea of what you can go into next. I mean, the tricky bit, I think, as a student or potential student, is sometimes a lack of information. So the Financial Times and the Economist, they publish quite detailed data. You can look at it for each business school. You can analyze, you can pinpoint what really interests you. But other rankings tend to conglomerate data under some indexes. And they put out a score out of 100. And I think you miss a lot of information. I mean, it doesn't tell you a lot that some school is 100 points and another is 50 points. I mean, you don't know what's behind it. So that lack of granularity make it, I think, less interesting and less useful for students because they cannot really draw the information they need. When I was at the FT, I remember we used to meet regularly with some students and they told us, no, they don't, there's the image of students, they just look at the list, they go from 1 to 10 and the rest they don't care. And that's not true, really. They really they read the data and they read the ranking in depth. They just don't focus on the 1 to 10 list and ignore the rest. So, for example, the FT has a criteria on international course experience, which is if you get to go abroad during your study. So, if this is one of your top priority or interest, then you can just look at this one criteria and ignore the overall ranking. Ranking is a tool that helps you select the school that you want to. It's not. I mean, it's kind of an early filter in your research. But it shouldn't be the primary tool. So it can help you make an early selection, and then you go and speak to the staff, the former students, and make a decision. So if you miss that early information, then it's more difficult to do this filtering. The Master in Management, I will use the FT because it's the most comprehensive, especially if you want to do it in Europe. Very few American schools participate, so if you want to do a Master in Management in the US, then in that case, maybe QS, because the FT wouldn't have data on it. Some ranking like US News focus entirely on US business schools. So if you're interested in studying in the US, maybe that'd be a good source of information. We mentioned Bloomberg Business Week. They tend to separate US school and international schools, so they're not under the same listing. So again, it's a bit tricky to put all schools together to compare like for like. So you're left with the FT or the Economist, which put all the schools together. They're not segregated by region. This is a usual criticism of ranking that it advantage some schools over others. So for like the international dimension, as you write, in Europe, it's a bit easier for schools to do well. But sometimes it's Asian schools that do better because, for example, the FT use a PPP rate from the IMF to convert local salary into US dollars. And the PPP rate, say, for India is very advantageous. It's like 4 times the exchange rate. Maybe for China, it's twice the exchange rate. So these PPP rates don't tend to work for very large countries. So it's a purchase power parity. So this is published biannually by the IMF, and this is time series that this is used for like GDP calculation maybe. This is to convert all salary and trades and anything, any exchange data into US dollars. So it takes into consideration the cost of living. I don't know if it takes into consideration tax, but it's like mostly the cost of living. The data is, you got students from all over the world, right? So when you collect, when the FT collects salary information for any given school, there are students all over the world. So the data you see is an aggregate. It's an average salary for all the students. and the salary are normalized, so it's kind of a central estimate. So, I mean, it would be difficult to go deep into the salary and say, oh, the PPP of this country, because the students may not be in this country. I mean, what's important is to look at the salary, compare the fees, and the FT measure the return on investment and the criterion called value for money. So you can look at value for money, and it tells you how quickly you will pay back the fees from your degree. I mean, there was a lot of, I remember when I joined the FT rankings in 2012, I mean, entrepreneurship became a bit the buzzword at the time, and there were a lot of schools asking about the impact of their performance in the ranking, and we didn't really collect much data back then about it, but then so we started collecting an awful lot of information, and it turned out that I mean, there are very few full-time entrepreneurs. I mean, most entrepreneurs tend to do it next to a corporate job. And the one who would do it full-time, I mean, they don't do badly. And they're not enough to make a significant negative impact on the ranking. But it's true that the ones which are geared toward finance and consulting will tend to do better, yes. I mean, typically business school, all the programs are in English because all schools want to attract international students. I mean, among all the participating schools in the FT, all the programs are in English. I mean, except for executive MBA, where you can have some tracks in local language. Master in Management MBA, all courses are in English. This is another big difference with university, which since, of course, university in the US and the UK programs are, of course, in English, but elsewhere, say in Europe or China, the program will be in the local languages. So that means they tend to attract much fewer international students. The better way to look at it actually is not to look at ranking in just 1 year, but to look at the performance of a school over several years. So then you can see a trend. So if the school is progressing in the ranking, then since it's been calculated on a consistent basis, then you can be fairly sure that the program is getting better comparatively to the other schools.